Hi, welcome to the Pastor Tanner Ministries channel. And one of the first things we wanted to do on this channel was record something like a glossary video, some sort of video to help you guys understand what I mean by the terminology I use and some of the words that will come up in many of the videos. Now, I have not always been interested in philosophy. It's something that I came to out of necessity as I was trying to understand epistemology. And as I studied it, I began to see that there are a million different terms and they're used in a variety of different ways. And there's not a lot of consistency within philosophy circles or textbooks or things like that on how things are used. And this was made even worse once I dove into critical realism, because critical realism itself has all sorts of terms and jargon and different things that a lot of people don't understand that are really unique to this own philosophic system and circle. As an example, I got a critical realist dictionary and I spent hours poring over that thing, just looking up specific terms, and it would explain them. And then I would almost have more questions than answers after I looked up those terms, and I have to go look up other ones that were being referenced. Now, of course, why all the jargon? Well, it can be helpful at times because sometimes words are inadequate to express the ideas, the thoughts, the concepts that you're trying to get at. But we also want the material that we're sharing in these videos to be accessible to people so that they can understand these things for themselves in a way that is helpful for their lives. And furthermore, I don't want you to have to read a bunch of this auxiliary material yourself. If you like it, then have at it. Be my guest, of course. But I want to try and put these things in terms that you can understand so that you don't have to run and try to learn all this philosophical jargon yourself. So in this video, I'm going to do a quick glossary of sorts of some of these terms that I'm going to be using regularly and what I roughly mean by them. And I want to be clear, I am not talking about dictionary definitions. I'm not going to denotatively tell you what the dictionary says these words mean. In fact, I'll talk about denotation versus connotation here in a little bit. That can cause problems of its own. Instead, what I'm going to do here is not even write down my definitions ahead of time, but talk about certain terms off of the top of my head, talk around the terms and the ideas so you can connotatively understand a bit what I mean. All right, with all of that said, let's jump right in. The first phrase I want to start with is critical realism. Critical realism is a philosophic system that was developed by Roy Bhaskar in a realist theory of science in the mid to late 70s, but he's certainly not the only person who has developed this. Critical realism has really exploded and it's taken many different shapes and forms. In fact, there are two primary areas to talk about critical realism. I see critical realism alive and well today in social science circles. And there are a lot of different people in the social sciences who focus on critical realism, and that's all very intriguing and interesting. I intend to talk about critical realism from an epistemological perspective. I think critical realism has a very powerful epistemology. So while I read some of the social science stuff, I'm really focused on applying its epistemology to a Christian context. And in this sense, critical realism has three primary pillars that we need to talk about. And I'll express these things in later videos and talk about them in greater detail. But critical realism is the melding together of three primary ideas. The first idea is ontological or metaphysical realism. That is, there are real things that exist out there independent of me. If you ask the age-old question, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody is there to hear it, does it make a sound? The critical realist position would say yes, because that tree exists independent of myself and my perception of it. And that leads us to our second pillar, and that is the fact that critical realists view epistemology as relativistic. Now, we got to be clear here. It's not ontology and metaphysics that are relativistic. Those things exist and are true independent of me. However, my perception of real things is relativistic because I'm confined and constrained by my limited perspective on the world. Now, if you have a realist metaphysic, but a relativist epistemology, how can you figure out what the truth is? That leads us to our third pillar, and that third pillar is called judgmental rationality. I need to adjudicate between all the various pieces of evidence, all the different ideas that I have, all the clues I have out there about the world. I need to map a pattern so I can try and understand what reality is or get as close to it as I possibly can. So those are the three pillars of critical realism: a realist ontology or metaphysic, a relativistic epistemology, and judgmental rationality to adjudicate. We'll talk about all of these things in much greater detail in future videos. The second term I want to talk about is epistemology. I've already used it a lot, but hopefully you can get an idea of what I mean as I describe it in greater detail. Epistemology classically is the study of knowledge, or how we know what we know. right? And there are various forms of this. There are various ways of doing epistemology or going about it. You might have heard of deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, might have heard of logic, etc. When I talk about epistemology, I just mean how we know what we know, or how we learn things, how we can know things about the world. Next, we'll talk about metaphysics. Now, I use the words metaphysics and ontology almost synonymously. You probably already heard me do that. Now, that may not be technically correct, but like I told you, once I started studying philosophy and trying to get an understanding of these terms, I found that many different authors would use terms in different ways. So there might be a greater denotative way to explicitly define metaphysics and ontology, but I often use them synonymously, and so I just want you to know that in the videos. That might change over time. Maybe you guys will educate me, but for right now, I kind of use the terms synonymously. And what does it mean? It means those things that are real, the study of being, the existence of things, the real things out there. With a realist ontology, I look at the world as having a real component to it that I'm trying to grasp, mediated through all of my senses and my mind and all of those things. At this point, it's probably helpful for me to define Cartesian, or at least how I use the word Cartesian. Cartesian comes from Descartes, right? And I've already talked about him. And I will often refer almost pejoratively to a Cartesian way of looking at things or viewing things. There's not a lot of nuance to it. Again, I think, therefore I am. It often has deductive components to it. It often assumes we know more than we actually can know, in my opinion. And it has a limited or reductionistic view of the world. And so when I'm referring to Cartesian, I'm often referring to that. Reductionism, I just thought of. Reductionism is when we try to limit our world. It's a very left hemisphere way of doing things, right? We reduce our world down so that we constrain it to certain things, and then it's much easier for us to chop up and look at, cut up into pieces and parts, define, etc. But all of these things I don't think work very well when you're operating in an open system like the world we happen to live in, all right? Reality itself is very much an open system with a lot of mystery, and it's multivariable, all right? So when you constrain things in a Cartesian way, it makes it easier to chop them up and define them, but you have to be aware of the fact that you're looking at a limited picture of reality. But many people of this perspective don't realize that their perspective is limited. Along these lines, sometimes I will refer to positivism. And again, I have no interest in telling you the history of positivism or where it came from, etc. But to me, it has all of these similar qualities and characteristics. Positivism essentially assumes in a naive way that we can grasp reality and that we can understand it and know it as it is, and that there's no mediation through my senses or through my mind or trying to think about things. It just positivistically assumes that this thing is true, and therefore I can easily grasp that it's true. And this couples with another term I'll often use called naive realism. Now again, critical realism is realist in its metaphysical way of looking at things. But unfortunately, many philosophers have often conflated metaphysics and epistemology so that many realists are what I would call naive realists. And again, I don't mean that term pejoratively. All I mean is that critical realists assume that the real object that I'm trying to grasp is still mediated through me as a human being with limited perspective. And a naive realist assumes that thing is true and I can easily get at that truth. And again, I believe it's because they conflate metaphysics and epistemology in a way that's unhelpful. All right, I want to talk now about empiricism. Empiricism is naive realism of a different sort. It's a naive realism that is focused on science and conducting experiments to try and achieve knowledge or arrive at conclusions via science. And don't get me wrong, I mean, Bhaskar's work is called A Realist Theory of Science, so we're not anti-science here. But oftentimes, people who are of a scientific perspective, again, naively believe that they can immediately grasp realities through certain, experiments and different things like that. And there's not as much appreciation for the fact that we live in a multivariable world where there's a lot of different factors coming into play when it comes to trying to understand conclusions from scientific experimentation. This leads me to another term, and this is the term fallibilist. Now, fallibilism is essentially a soft foundationalism approach that believes that we as human beings are fallible. So even if you want to be a foundationalist, you can be a fallible foundationalist or a fallibilist. And to me, this approach is very nice. If you want to be a foundationalist, then I think a fallibilist form of foundationalism can be very, very helpful, and it's much closer to the critical realism that I'll be advocating for in this channel. I've already used several of these terms, but I want to talk about a few concepts that will help you to understand logic and rationality and how we arrive at knowledge in general. And these are the three terms: deductive, inductive, and abductive inference. Let me start with deductive. The way I look at deductive information is that it's logical, that you start with some sort of axiom, and then you drill down from that rule or that objective truth or reality into more specifics below that. And so, again, I think therefore I am strikes me as a very deductive way of looking at the world. I think the classic deductive syllogism is Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. And maybe I got premise A and premise B mixed up, but you get the idea. And the whole point is that you can arrive at certain conclusions through deductive logical reasoning. Math is built on deduction. The laws of logic are built on deduction. That is kind of a stereotypical way of thinking about it. Now, I don't have a problem with deduction in general. Logic is good and helpful. Math is helpful. These are nice tools to have in your tool belt. However, as somebody who prescribes to epistemic humility, I have a lot greater questions about what we can be certain about. I don't often like to talk about certainty. I like to talk about confidence. And I think this is really important for Christians because if you are certain about something, you do not need faith. However, if you are confident about it, you do need faith. This is part of why I think critical realism is much more in line with Christianity than a deductive or positivistic, Cartesian epistemology actually is. The opposite of deduction is called induction. And this is where we don't start with an explicit rule, but we start with individual cases, particulars, and then we try to work our way up to what is the common rule, right? And this is how science is done. You conduct several individual experiments, and when you notice patterns, then you kind of work your way up to a law or a rule. Induction is much closer to how I view things in terms of how we learn things. I just think it's kind of natural that we come into the world with limited knowledge and we start experimenting as even young children, and we start to learn and understand things about the world, and then we map patterns. And a key difference between deduction and induction is that the conclusions of induction are not certain. We can maybe be confident about them, but they're not certain. And I think that, again, matches our reality just a bit better. However, there's a third term that I'm really interested in, and this is actually what got me looking into critical realism to begin with. And this is the term abduction or abductive inference. This is actually epistemologically how I stumbled into critical realism. I found the topic of abductive inference to be fascinating, and I started studying that. After that, I discovered a philosopher named Charles Peirce, spelled Pierce with the E and the I switched, but pronounced Peirce. And as I began to study him, he talked about abductive inference, and this led me into the critical realism space. Now, abductive inference is really important to my paradigm and how I view knowledge in the world. So I'm going to take a little bit more time here, and I'm actually going to give you a dictionary definition on this one, just so you can understand what it means. Charles Peirce described abductive inference as an inferential process which proceeds as follows. The surprising fact C is observed. But if A were true, C would be a matter of course. Hence, there is reason to suspect that A is true. All right. So that's kind of the abductive inference process. And I believe that almost all knowledge we have as human beings comes to us through a process of abductive inference. We notice clues out there in the world, and then we map patterns. The clues are C. Surprising fact C is observed, but if A were true, C would be a matter of course. Therefore, I have reason to believe or suspect that A is true. It gives me confidence, but not necessarily certainty. And again, there are a lot of books on abductive reasoning and abductive inference. You have this absolute monstrosity, but I want to be clear. I came to critical realism because it is the philosophical or epistemological system that embraces abductive inference, whole hog. They have a full-throated embrace of abductive inference, or what they often call retroduction, within critical realism itself, and that's part of why it's so attractive to me. This leads me to my next phrase, and it's inference to the best explanation, and this is essentially what I mean. I use these synonymously, that essentially abduction or abductive reasoning is inference to the best explanation. The idea is you're looking out at the world around you, you observe certain things, and you ask yourself, what would have to be true about the world for this observation to make sense? All right. And that's inference to the best explanation. Again, I just believe as human beings, that is almost all the knowledge we have, is some sort of inference to the best explanation of the combined experiences we've had and those different things we're observing. I want to talk about one more thing related to critical realism, one last idea, and that's the idea of stratified reality. Now, this can be very complex and difficult for people to understand, but Bhaskar posited a reality that is kind of three-tiered or layered, if you will. And he talks about the actual and the real and the empirical and all these different things. All I would say is that I might offhand use this to describe the fact that the world is multivariable. And there's a lot going on out there. There are not only the things we observe, but there are also things we're not observing. And then there are underlying mechanisms and structures and processes that influence the observables. And you just need to have a basic understanding that the world is complex and simplistic single variable explanations don't really account for much to understand the idea of a stratified reality. All right, I want to cover a last few here that are maybe not so philosophical, but instead just general terms I might use. I talk often about left hemisphere and right hemisphere, all right? And whether or not you subscribe to hemispheric lateralization, I think is irrelevant. They're concepts and terms that are used to describe categories or ways of viewing the world. You don't have to believe with Ian McGilchrist about, these specific ways that the brain is set up in order to find these terms and these ways of describing things to be helpful. The left hemisphere likes to chop things up. It likes to define them. It likes to, put together a closed system and then analyze it to death. The right hemisphere observes the gestalt. It looks at things holistically, big picture, imaginatively, creatively, etc. And there are pop versions of hemispheric lateralization that may not necessarily be helpful. And there can often be a lot of infighting in neuroscience regarding hemispheric lateralization. Again, I might just use left hemisphere, right hemisphere offhand to kind of describe either that, breaking down or defining of things versus this more holistic, big picture, both and understanding of the world. I believe the world is not so much either or as it is both and. One final thing I want to define here, and it has to do with language, and that is semiotics. Semiotics is a study of sign theory, and I'm really interested in it when it comes to language and how language is used. When we talk about theology and doctrine, we can really get hung up on language in Christian circles. And I believe that is because we are so focused on denotation, i.e. dictionary definitions of things. What does this explicitly mean? And again, as a critical realist or somebody who believes in epistemic humility, I don't necessarily agree with denotations of words so much. Don't get me wrong, that can be helpful, and we can't just willy-nilly change words, but the way semiotics functions and works demonstrates the fact that we as human beings make changes to our language over time, all the time. And that's been happening all throughout human history. And so people will use turns of phrases and different words in different ways, and then it just catches on and people start using words in those ways. There are a lot of common phrases nowadays that people use that I couldn't have recognized 10 or 15 years ago, and it's just because it's common parlance now. This is how language works. It's much more connotative, and it gets shaped or molded by the way human beings use words. So also, I hope that this would help me to recognize a little bit of humility when I'm trying to examine somebody else's work. So if they use a word the wrong way or something like that, that's fine. I need to try and understand what they mean by their use of the word. This is just the muddiness of human communication in general. And so I am often much more interested in connotation, not denotation, hence this whole video. And when I'm examining other people's work, that's what I'm interested in. Don't get me wrong. If I use a word or a turn of phrase in the wrong way, help educate me, and I can try to use it in a more precise way in the future. But oftentimes I will essentially be appealing to the fact that you get what I mean. You see? And that, to me, is a more connotative way of viewing things. And to me, it's more consistent with semiotics in general. Okay, that's it for my initial glossary. Maybe it hurt more than it helped. I don't know. I put a lot of words out there, and I had to use other words to describe them. But maybe this will at least give you a sense of what I'm on about as I start to work through some individual videos, talk through certain themes and ideas, and start to engage with other people's content with an eye towards helping you to understand this unique epistemology and how it folds into Christianity going forward in our world. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful for you. Leave a comment if you have any questions or anything like that, or if there's further content you would like to see along these lines. Appreciate you all very much. Take care. God bless. Bye.